So my name is Lance Peterman. Just a little bit about me. You may have seen this slide before. Okay. Because you're not going to get it. Okay. I was going to say, because I can talk to this. I have a voice that's not kind to small rooms. So I've been in IT for about 23 years now. Spent the large part of it in and around the information security area, particularly focused for really the last 10 on identity and access management. And I kind of relish the fact that I'm a little bit of an odd duck at most security cons, because identity, in my experience, doesn't seem to get a lot of play at your traditional security cons. And as John pointed out, a lot of the emphasis at BSides and most security cons tends to be on the offensive side, which is great. I kind of like opening up because I'm the defense. So, and I'm not the only defense, but obviously I have some opinions that make me think that this defense is important. So, in addition to my current job at Merck, I'm also an adjunct professor at UNC Charlotte in the main campus. I teach software architecture and design. Safe harbor, of course, all of these opinions that I'm about to share are my own. Some of them will be war stories from either my job or from talking to other people. And you can always reach out to me on Twitter, LinkedIn. I'm not hard to find because there's just not that many Lance Petermans in the world. I guess that's a good thing. And I will be publishing these slides on SlideShare. Oops, if you turn it on. There you go. Okay, so this was actually 2 days ago, which of course was Cinco de Mayo. But how many of you also know that it was another special day? And being in security, you should all know this. It was World Password Day. So I'm going to attempt to do this. If the audio doesn't come out right, I'll kill it. But we have a special message from someone.
I like my salsa hot, my drink stiff, and I'm only an early riser because I partied like and salute the sunrise. But sugar, I don't mess around when it comes to passwords or security, because you don't get to my age unless you're practicing safe set. Boy, if those tabloids got a hold of my passwords, well, it'd be quite of an endorsement for hot yoga. But I got my situation on lock and found myself the beefiest bouncer around to stand watch. And I have to admit, the view is not bad from back here. His name is multi-factor authentication. And yeah, I may not take his last name, but it gets the job done. So the next time you work a password, remember to wear protection. Get MFA. Double bag those passwords. But remember, you want the beat to grow, not your personal life.
You guys might have cheated and got a preview of that on my Twitter feed, but I just couldn't resist. I mean, Betty White, although how do I follow that? So, there's obviously a link to the talk with passwords. Mainly it was for entertainment value, but credentials are a key part of the hacking world, the security kill chain. And so one of the pieces of this, and it's been my emphasis, and I gave a talk 2 years ago at this conference, kind of doing an introduction to privileged access management. And given the newness of the audience, I'll go over some of those concepts again. But the real goal of this talk was to kind of, well, let's be honest, in 2 years I've learned a lot more about privileged access management. And I'd like to share some of those pieces of actual implementations as opposed to, let's take a look at this vendor or let's take a look at this vendor. It's going to be more of a vendor agnostic talk, and it's going to be more about the how of privileged access management, which surprisingly enough doesn't necessarily involve the technology. So in doing so, we'll talk about what PAM is, just to do as a level set. We'll go briefly through a couple of breaches specifically tied to privileged access, and then we'll talk about PAM as a program, and then finally kind of the money section of the talk. We'll talk about some of the keys to success as part of adopting it, and then also some challenges and final thoughts. So what is PAM? This is what it's not, obviously. Privileged access management. These are kind of dyed-in-the-wool definitions. So, while they are a little textbooky, don't consider them to be, the Bible of privileged access, because especially as I get to some of the breaches, what can constitute privilege may not necessarily neatly fit in this definition. But this is the conventional definition of any feature, any level of access to a system that basically gets you that kind of root administrator or higher order access that can override application controls. Privileged accounts or identities are obviously those credentials that allow you to create those to leverage that access. And that necessarily doesn't imply a human behind it. It could also be a system account or a device account. And then the use of privileged accounts should be managed and the password monitored when they're stored digitally. And this is kind of my policy statement that comes out of this. And you'll hear me talk about policy a lot, because these types of programs don't succeed in your company unless there's policy behind it. But this is basically, in essence, the essence of privileged access management. So why is privileged access management important? Well, part of it is because, there's been this within my field when I go to identity conferences. One of the favorite sayings they have right now is that identity is the new perimeter. And of course, they want to say that because, we're passionate about digital identity, and it is important. I kind of disagree with the statement, though, because I don't think identity is the new perimeter. I actually think the perimeter is gone. The old idea that you have this castle and moat mentality and you can control who gets in and who doesn't get in is a little bit gone by the wayside. As you guys have worked at your various jobs or had experience with other companies, data's moving everywhere. So you have an environment that's much more like this, where, based on a device that has access to Dropbox, it was in my enterprise 5 minutes ago, it's now out in the wild 5 minutes later. Or you have a software as a service that you're leveraging for your critical functionality that's sitting in a data center that you have no control over the security controls in that organization. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, because those guys may be on the hook for doing tighter security than even you're doing. But the point being is that data's moving everywhere. Now, identity is critical still to determining what you're authorized to do with that data, and that's obviously what we're going to talk about here, but I just want to kind of put that mythology to rest. So we're going to talk about a couple of breaches. If you saw the old talk, some of these may be familiar, but they're still relevant because I like them because they talk specific to the vector within PAM. The first one is service accounts. You guys are probably familiar with the breach of the Department of Revenue in South Carolina, since they're our neighbors about 15 minutes away from here. 3.4 million individual taxpayers and businesses had their records compromised as part of that breach. And one of the things I did love about Nikki Haley, and she's obviously a politician, so they're going to try and paint this in the best terms possible. So they painted it as these really sophisticated hackers and this really sophisticated attack, when probably everybody in this room knows it really wasn't that hard. Given the security infrastructure that they had at the time, I suspect anybody in this room could have gotten into their network. And the reality was, and this is again why I call out the definition of privileged access, this was not a high-level system admin account that was compromised. It was a backup account. And a lot of people don't think of backup accounts as being necessarily privileged identities, but the reality was, because this account was responsible for backing up the taxpayer database, which happened to not be encrypted, they were able to exfiltrate that data. So that's one aspect of this. The other one that a lot of people won't look at with respect to privileged access management, and it's probably the most critical one, is local admin accounts, whether it is the user themselves who has local admin access to their workstation, or just the administrator account that the user may not necessarily have access to. In the case of the Saudi Aramco breach, this was an insider attack where somebody got a little disgruntled, but because this company, and I'm making fun of Saudi Aramco, but a lot of companies unfortunately do this, they have the same password or similar passwords for all of their local admin accounts on all of their workstations. And so this guy knew what that one password was, and was able to erase, just running a simple script, erase 30,000 hard drives. Now the good news was Saudi Aramco actually had some decent SecOps from a backup perspective, and they were able to get back up and running relatively quickly, But to say that this was a disruptive attack would be an understatement. And they did lose some data out of this in spite of the backups. So in looking at that, how does your organization manage those credentials? Does your primary user, do you have admin access to your workstation? And of course, everybody here says yes, because I'm not going to get caught by one of those attacks, right? Yeah, I'd love to say I'm one of those people, but I got hit by ransomware about 2 years ago. And I still, to this day, have no idea what I clicked that created the ransomware attack. So probably something that got past my ad blocker. But so it happens. So one of the things you can talk about, and I'll talk through this later with respect to the best practices, is if you can get users to give up their local admin privileges, obviously giving them access to those privileges in an alternative fashion, you can stop a lot of attacks. I was talking with Dave Kennedy, who was keynoting at a conference that I was at 2 days ago, and I just asked him point blank. I said, if we've revoked admin access to all of these users, a lot of your attacks get harder, don't they? And he said, absolutely. So that's one of the things to consider. And then, of course, briefly, eBay, typical spear phishing attack. One of their key IT people got hit. So it even happens to the IT folks. They're security aware too, but they're not security perfect. Nobody is really. And one of the things that I call out here is, does your primary account, and by that I mean the same account that you use to send emails, does that have elevated access to other systems in your company? There's a good chance the answer to that is yes, depending upon your job role. And it's a matter of convenience. But one of the things you may want to consider is segregating that access, whether you create one admin account that you can use against multiple systems, or the real pain in the butt approach is you create multiple admin accounts. But the important thing is you separate that access. If I click on an email that has a malware attachment in it, if I've lost my admin access, they can't execute what they need to do to implement the malware, most likely, not guaranteed. And more importantly, they can't do anything with the credential that they just stole. And then finally, this is one of my favorite examples. Default passwords is the bane of any enterprise's existence. In this particular scenario, the 2 Canadian teenagers found an old ATM manual and discovered that all of the ATMs built with this have a default password. Well, guess what they did? They went and found somewhere that had this older version of the ATM, and admittedly, it was a very old ATM relative to the standards that are out there today, but they managed to find one, and guess what? It still had the default password on it. So needless to say, they were able to do a little damage with that. So what does that tell us? Obviously, the threat landscape is changing daily, but a lot of the patterns are kind of the same. Compromised or privileged access is the key stage in 100% of all advanced attacks. Now, I'm not saying all of them involve privileged credentials, because I think that would be a kind of a biased viewpoint, but all of them include privilege elevation. How you achieve that may involve credentials. That's the easier target, or you may be using exploits and things like that, but that's obviously not the focus of this talk. This is the critical attack vector for internal and external threats. A recent report from Thycotic said 45% of hackers directly target privileged credentials now. I think they said 33% are going after the basic user credentials now. You guys are probably all familiar with the Verizon Data Breach Investigator report. 97% of all breaches are preventable through basic and intermediate controls. This is obviously just one of them. In 2012, 43% of respondents to a survey said they either didn't have a PAM practice of any kind, or they weren't sure if they did. And if they aren't sure if they did, one of two things is true. Either A, they don't, or B, it's not a very good one. So we're going to go briefly through the practice of privileged access management. It's basically designed to answer some very basic questions. Who or what has that level of privileged access? When was it used? Where was it used from? Because if you're in an organization where you may outsource or manage service some of your access, that's especially important to understand what your managed providers are doing on your network. Because you not only have the potential for insider attacks from here, but they could be naughty as well. And sometimes it's not even a question of being naughty. You look at the target breach, it was a third-party vendor who got compromised, and that's how they were able to get in. So you could put in the best controls over your individual users and create, you know, a magical security awareness program. You can't control the guys that are part of your third-party vendor. And one thing I do emphasize, and you may hear this a couple of more times, technology is only one part of the equation. People and process, and my previous talks actually started off with a horse story because one of my passions in life is working with my horses. And one of my horses got out because I didn't close the gate properly. And had all the great controls in the world, but if you don't close that gate and make sure that it's stuck, horse gets out. So, and then finally, this has to be a part of your governance process. If you don't know what your governance process is at your company, that's where you start. But one of the key things that, frankly, I have some scars from, even though I preached this from the outset, when you're working with the business on this, this cannot be considered kind of a one-off enrollment, like, okay, you guys are knocking out my door, I understand I need to get compliant, what do I got to do to make you go away? And the answer is A, yes, we want to enroll you in our privileged access management program, but B, you have to continually demonstrate compliance. And when demonstrating compliance includes monitoring how your privileged accounts are managed and what's done with them. This slide I won't go into a whole lot of detail on, but one of the things that I want to call out is a lot of the larger companies have some relatively sophisticated IT enterprise models, whether it is ITIL, SDLC, DevOps, or ITSM. One of the critical ways to gain success in privileged access management is to get integrated with those programs. What we do at Merck is when we're onboarding a new application, they go through that process of onboarding, and then for those applications that may not necessarily be onboarded yet, when they come to the change review board and they say, hey, I need to schedule an outage for next weekend, first question we ask them is, have your privileged accounts been enrolled? And if the answer is no, we may not tell them, you know, if they're looking for an outage next weekend, we may not tell them, well, you can't do that then. But that's our way of getting engaged with those guys to say, you need to get those accounts onboarded so that we can manage how they're being accessed. The other thing that I'll call out here is one of the toughest things about privileged access management is you can install a firewall and the users don't blink, unless, of course, you block port 80 and 443. But generally, a lot of security practices are designed to be frictionless to the user to be successful. PAM is not one of those experiences. We're going to make the lives of the people that operate these privileged accounts at least a little bit harder. But what you have to sell them on, and hopefully this talk will help feed this a little bit, is the why of that. And so that's why those business relationships are so critical. And it's not just for privileged access management, it's for security in general. If you can have partnerships with your business customers and constantly communicate with them, but when you're getting ready to do a project, you can help explain them the why of it successfully, more often than not, you're not going to get as much friction in enabling that. And I'm not going to say that that's a perfect story, because I still get a lot of friction with it. But we've also had a lot more success because of it. So that's one of the things, you know, educate and engage your business owners whenever possible. So briefly, this is more for future reference. I am going to be making these slides available on SlideShare. But this was my attempt at a PAM reference architecture, and obviously it starts with the PAM piece. So you have your password vault, you have session management and recording, PAM policy management, because you're going to have policies surrounding some of those accounts. You may have a segregation of duty policy depending upon, you know, what type of systems you may be enabling. You're going to have discovery and policy enforcement. Discovery is great sometimes because you can actually discover when new accounts come up in your business, and you can automatically enroll them into your PAM product for most products. And then in addition to session management and recording, and I'll talk through the use case in a second, have some function set up to do session review. Because it doesn't, you know, if you record it but you never look at it, what was the point of recording it? And then, of course, you're going to overlay that or integrate that with your identity and access management layer. That includes your core user identities, but it also includes your non-person credentials. And I separate this out. Ordinarily, this would be considered part of your identity management program. But I wanted to call this out because these are those system accounts that are on all these devices that are out there that typically have a lot higher access than your average user account will. But you also want to account for what those accounts are capable of doing. And then finally, you want to have access certification. If I have root access or high-level system access to a database, at least within a year, my manager should be able to attest that, yes, Lance still needs access to that system. So having that access certification process, and that may not necessarily be intrinsic to the PAM tooling that you're buying, so you're going to have to work with your identity management group to hopefully create that access certification, but that's a critical piece of this process. And then you achieve that by integrating that with your various IT resources. Your policy store, your SRM or ticketing, whether it's Remedy, ServiceNow, or whatever. Workflow could be outside of your product. Some of the products also support their own workflow functions. You need logging and audit, obviously. And then ideally, you should integrate this with your CMDB and change management process. That's really where you get the teeth behind this program. And then finally, there's some encouraging work taking place in this area. It's already taking place and relatively mature in the SIEM space, but in the analytics space, it's even more interesting. And I'll get to that in just a minute. But trying to create identity or what we call user behavior analytics out of this is an interesting potential. So now we're going to talk through a couple of use cases. These are the big use cases. And the top one is what you would call your classic vaulting scenario, where the user is going to go to your privileged access management tool, they're going to check out the password, and they're going to go to the system, paste in that password, and then after they check the password back in, ideally you would change that password. That's the ideal pattern when you have to vault. The more ideal scenario is what we call the session management scenario, where the user ideally doesn't even have awareness of what the privileged password is, or the credential for that matter, although obviously they may be able to figure some of it out. But the same scenario, they're going to go to the privileged access tool, they're going to check that credential out, but instead of going to whatever tool they're going to use, you instantiate the tool from within the PAM tool, and whether it's doing SSH to a Linux server or whether it's remote desktop to a Windows server, that session instantiates from within the PAM tool, and what that allows you to do is record what takes place. And that's where you get some real bang for the buck. But that's also where you get the most secure solution because A, the administrator doesn't know, or whoever the user is, doesn't know the credentials being used, particularly the password. And B, from a change management perspective, and this is where you sell it to your change management board, they can go back through the recordings and figure out what took place in a particular session so that when you do have an incident, even if it's not a security incident, they may be able to figure out what took place. And so this could be a real asset in their arsenal. Other use cases, most of the PAM tools nowadays can use APIs to manage script and batch management. So instead of storing the credentials in those scripts, how many of us work at companies that do that today? Unfortunately, way too many. And those are typically higher level credentials too, because they have to have the ability to manipulate data. I've already talked about local workstations. Other use cases involve cloud infrastructure and SaaS accounts, so working with your Amazon accounts. Also, any SaaS products that are out there. Oftentimes, you can use APIs to change those. Virtualization platforms, don't forget your VMware infrastructure. The root accounts on those systems have a lot of power to them, and I'll give you a little bit of a joke about that in a minute. And most importantly, look at all of your hardware platforms, including the industrial systems. Don't just think of it in terms of the client-server hierarchy. Look at your networking devices. Look at your SCADA systems. Even in some instances, this is still kind of growing. Look at your Internet of Things, the devices that are coming into your enterprise. Where's your risk at? That's ultimately what's going to drive this. And I'm going to skip through the adoption approach here because I know we're running a little short on time. The one thing I will say with respect to the adoption approach, verify that they're using your privileged access management tool. And I say this somewhat jokingly, but because it should be obvious, right? But one of the things we had early on when we had a managed service provider that was helping onboard our customers, and occasionally they would get friction about the onboarding, not the fact that we created an entry for this account, but part of that process, for obvious reasons, has to involve changing that password. And then we go, oh, wait a minute, we've got an outage coming up in 3 weeks. We really can't afford to change it right now. So if you can just give us a little bit of time, we'll get it changed and we'll take care of it. And we're like, okay, we don't want to disrupt you guys too much. 5 months later, they still aren't using the product. So this is where you run into challenges. Because PAM isn't just about compliance. Ultimately, it's about security, as my friend Fernando would say, and I'm not going to attempt to do his voice. So what are some keys to success here? The first is fault tolerance, obviously. If you're storing all of your privileged identities in one place, it has to be fault tolerant. That kind of goes without saying. If you're a global company, you should be architect, or even if you're not, if it's just a United States company, you should architect for performance and geography. So your West Coast and your East Coast should have the same type of latency. Or if you're global, same rules apply, but probably even more so. Support for this must have senior leadership adoption. I can't stress that enough. This is one of those programs that cannot start from the ground up and you walk around and you go, hey guys, I got this really cool tool that'll help you manage privileged identities. You're going to get the, yeah, whatever. It's just not something that they want to focus on. Focus on the process first, then the tooling. I've already talked about consider integrating it with your CMDB if your CMDB is up to date. That can often be a challenge in some bigger companies. It was for us. We invested a major effort for the last 2 years in cleaning up our CMDB, and it's a lot more useful to us now. Be creative with this. One size does not fit all. So when you go back to that reference architecture, don't feel like you have to adopt all of those processes. Even if you're just starting out with a privileged password vault, that could be moving you light years ahead from a security perspective. When you're selecting a vendor, consider cloud implications. Can they talk to your various cloud vendors that you work with, your SaaS providers? Can you change passwords at that level? If not, you may stay with that vendor, but you might consider an alternative vendor to support that piece. Don't virtualize your vault. People go, but why? Here's why. Now, in defense of CyberArk, which is one of the major PAM vendors out there, and a very good vendor, I will also add, because Kevin also said several tweets later, he still considers them one of the top vendors in the market. The reason they were complaining about it wasn't the tool itself, it was how it was implemented. It was configured using ESX, so the vault itself was running as a virtual machine on a server that was shared with 50 other hosts, and that was a vector for attack. And not surprisingly, he went after it. Eat your own dog food first. That kind of makes standard sense, I would hope. Get used to the PAM tooling yourself. Start securing your own accounts with it. You're going to get experience with the tooling. That way you can share it with your customer base. And then finally, don't think you're too small for this. Even if you can't afford to negotiate with a company like a CyberArk or Quest or Lieberman or whoever, think about getting a vault. You know, you can even, there's some open source vaults out there that can get you guys started. But just because you're a 50-person company, A, doesn't mean you don't have privileged accounts. You do. And B, doesn't mean you shouldn't be trying to do something to protect them. So final thoughts here. Clash with teams on tooling and process is going to be common. Database administrators in particular, but this can be true of any IT organization. They have certain tools that they want to use to access their databases with. And sometimes your PAM tooling may not necessarily support them. So you've got to work out a compromise on that. Make sure you're monitoring for out-of-band accounts, particularly with domain administrators. If you have a domain administrator, guess what you can also create? Other domain administrators. So you want to be monitoring for that. And the good news is most of the PAM tools out there today will monitor the creation of new accounts. So you could either sandbox those accounts or you could auto-enroll them into the PAM tool. Make sure your priorities are where they're supposed to be. If you're partnering with the business, but they're like, you know what, I've got a day job and, you know, which is true of just about everybody, you know, they're going to say, hey, I really don't have time for this. If their boss is calling on the phone and says, oh, by the way, you have time for this, that's how you get success out of this. And you hate to use that stick approach. Ideally, you want to start with the carrot. And sometimes you can. If you sell them on the priority for it, sometimes that happens, but sometimes you do have to bring the stick. One way of doing that sometimes for certain professionals is make it a KPI. Tie it to their bonus. That'll guarantee you, if they get a bonus, that'll guarantee their attention. The cloud can mess this all up, except where it doesn't. Like I said, there's kind of a transition time in getting some of the cloud vendors on board with this. It's getting a lot better. Taking a look at APIs, one of the key challenges when you are looking at an API strategy, if that happens to be part of your focus, is when is the access of an API privileged access? When does it rise to that level? And you're going to manage that based on risk. And then finally, with respect to the role of analytics, This is kind of a burgeoning area. It's still a little immature in the identity space. So when you look at user behavior analytics, you're going to look at it much more from a more conventional security context. But you can still monitor using those analytics tools what your privileged identities are, and when things are happening that are out of the norm with those privileged identities, you can use analytics and some of your orchestration tools to maybe manage what's happening with those. So if there's an application that is doing things that it ordinarily doesn't do, maybe you disable that service account or delete that service account and insert a new service account immediately after that, hopefully minimizing disruption, but it might be a way of thwarting an attack. And with that, any questions?
Just a quick example of some metrics besides obvious ground zero. We have a whole bunch of accounts that have privileged access. Besides the ground zero one, obviously, what are some quick metrics to create like management buy-in?
Probably the easiest metric I look at is understanding who's actually using the tool. So how are you onboarded this account 2 weeks ago? Has that administrator logged into this tool? Now, sometimes some of these accounts are arcane, so they may only go in once a quarter to use this account. So obviously, you have to have some context for that, but you can look at your adoption rate from that. And the other metric, and it's a little bit dumber metric, but unfortunately some senior execs may buy into this one, is how many accounts you have, what percentage of them have been onboarded. If you're successful in getting in them properly adopting the tool, that becomes a much more effective metric, but it's the one they'll probably pay the most attention to. Any other questions?
You mentioned open source solutions or free solutions.
Uh-huh.
Are there any in particular that you would recommend?
Well, I was strictly talking with respect to the password vaulting.
Okay.
To be honest, there may be some open source tools out there. I'm not personally aware of them. Yes, sir.
What about some of the solutions, like especially AWS, the IAM and stuff like that? As far as it's not necessarily specifically issuing passwords for services and that type of thing, but a lot of the services now, you get more into like providing privileges to like systems or other things, so that the design of it is a little bit different to eliminate passwords and things like that. Or any thoughts on that, or how that kind of integrating into those types of environments, or whether that's
Well,
there's some issues with it, but
yeah, I mean, there are some issues with it. I think it's a great question because that's, and it kind of comes from two vectors. One is those type of accounts are the most dangerous ones from that perspective, because they can do a lot of damage if they're compromised. But by the same token, the more that you can get away from the password model, now admittedly from a security perspective, sometimes that can open up new vectors to attack, like pass the hash, things of that nature. But if you can get to a passwordless solution, that all the better. You're obviously looking at hopefully some more sophisticated ways of authenticating those accounts so that they can execute those functions. The vendors today aren't as caught up with that yet, because in spite of identity vendors telling you how much they're going to kill the password, they haven't quite achieved that yet. And frankly, I don't think they're going to anytime soon. But we are getting some good inroads into coming up with alternative authentication mechanisms that I think will help support that in the future. I think I saw somebody back here. Yes, sir.
Have you heard of a product or an open source tool called Ships?
Ships?
Yeah, by Trusted Tech, Dave Kennedy.
I have not.
Okay. It rotates local passwords, basically, to make it more difficult to pivot to other channels.
Oh, okay, cool. Yes, sir.
Are there products you'd recommend?
I always try and avoid this. Here's what I will say. There are a lot of great vendors out in that space, and I will list some of them, but this list is by no means all-inclusive. Lieberman Software makes a really good product. CyberArk, obviously, there was a joke at their expense here, but they also make a very good product. It used to be Quest, now it's Dell. Dell has a PAM product that's pretty solid. There are a couple of cloud-based vendors, and one of them just shot right out of my head. I can't remember the name. Those are some of the big ones that are out there. I know some of the other vendors, a lot of people are trying to get in this space. Oracle has been trying to get in this space, and I'm not necessarily going to advocate for them, but you know, they're recognizing if you guys are a huge Oracle shop, they might be worth taking a look at because they might have some unique advantages working within your Oracle product suite to manage that privileged access. But a lot of the other vendors will give you assistance in that space as well. But those are some of the big ones. Hope that helps. Anybody else? Yes, sir.
How do these PAM type applications compare to other identity management solutions like Centrify or something like that?
I appreciate you mentioning Centrify because that was the one that shot right out of my head. I could not remember their name. Centrify is definitely in this space. Their value proposition is managing a lot of the cloud-based privileged identities. They are trying to focus a little bit more on, you know, your enterprise infrastructure privileged access as well. So they're definitely a vendor in that space, and they're very similar. I mean, similar vaulting and session management, things of that nature. Anybody else? Well, thank you guys very much for your attention and your questions. Enjoy the rest of the conference.